There's a reason this teaching was kept inside the palace walls for 300 years. Not because it was sacred, because it was dangerous. When ordinary people learn how trust actually forms, they stop needing permission from kings, priests, and merchants. They stop waiting to be chosen. I'm going to share this with you today, but understand, once you see it, you can't go back to performing. You can't pretend you don't know. A student once asked me, "Master, why do some people enter a room and immediately everyone relaxes, while others speak for hours and we remain guarded?" I smiled, because he'd asked the question that topples empires. The answer has nothing to do with charisma, credentials, or clever words. It lives in something so simple you've been stepping over it your entire life. You've been taught that trust is something you earn through achievement, consistency, and carefully chosen words. That's why you're exhausted and still not trusted. What I'm going to share with you today exposes a completely different mechanism, one that the powerful have always understood, but rarely spoke about openly. Trust is not built, it's recognized. People don't trust you because you've proven yourself. They trust you because you've stopped pretending. Right now, as you're listening to this, you're probably carrying a weight you don't even notice anymore. It's the weight of wondering how you're coming across, the weight of managing your image, the weight of trying to say the right thing, be the right way, present the right version of yourself so that people will finally see you as trustworthy. And I want you to know something. That weight is the exact thing preventing people from trusting you. You walk into rooms feeling like an imposter. You rehearse conversations in your head before they happen. You over-explain, over-qualify, and watch people's eyes glaze over while your heart races with the question, do they believe me? Do they trust me? Am I saying this right? You think the problem is that you haven't done enough yet, that you need more credentials, more proof, more evidence of your worth. So you work harder, you achieve more, you build your resume, and somehow the distance between you and others grows wider instead of narrower. Here's what nobody told you. We've confused trust with approval. We think trust is about being liked, being impressive, being seen as competent or accomplished. But trust has nothing to do with any of that. Trust is about being real in a way that allows others to be real too. When you perform, you force everyone around you to perform. When you relax into your actual self, confused, uncertain, imperfect, you give everyone permission to exhale. And in that exhalation, in that shared humanity, trust appears like morning light. You don't create it. You simply stop blocking it. Most advice about trust tells you to build credibility through external proof. Get the degrees, collect the testimonials, establish the track record, maintain consistency, never show weakness, never admit mistakes. I'm telling you the opposite. The fastest path to being trusted is to stop trying to control how you're perceived and start living from the part of you that doesn't need anything from anyone. This isn't about being authentic as a strategy, as another clever technique to manipulate people into trusting you. It's about recognizing that your anxiety about trust is creating the very untrustworthiness others sense in you. You're not insufficient, you're not broken. You've simply been performing a role for so long you forgot there's a human being beneath it. And that human being is the only thing anyone has ever actually trusted. Let me tell you a story that will help you understand what I mean. Many years ago, in a city I visited during my travels, two merchants arrived on the same day. Both were strangers. Both came from distant lands. Both hoped to establish their businesses and earned the trust of the local people. But they took very different approaches, and what happened to them reveals everything you need to know about how trust actually works. The first merchant, let's call him Wei, was a man of great ambition and intelligence. He understood that as a stranger in a new city, he would need to establish his credibility quickly. So he set about this task with tremendous energy and strategy. He spent his first weeks networking, visiting every tea house and market square, introducing himself to everyone he met. He would tell them about his successful deals in other cities, about the officials who had praised his work, about the royal connections he had cultivated over the years. He carried letters of recommendation and would show them to anyone who seemed important. His conversations were carefully crafted presentations of his flawless record, his expertise, his reputation. Wei was always talking, always explaining, always making sure people understood who he was and why they should trust him. He would arrive early to gatherings so he could position himself prominently. He would dress in his finest clothes, speak in his most refined manner, and carefully monitor how people responded to him. If someone seemed skeptical, he would talk more, offer more proof, tell more stories about his successes. He was tireless in his efforts to convince everyone of his trustworthiness. The second merchant, I'll call him Lin, took a different approach entirely. Actually, it would be more accurate to say he took no approach at all. He simply arrived in the city, found a modest space for his stall, and began his work. He offered no introductions. He made no announcements about who he was or where he came from. He didn't visit the tea houses to network or seek out the influential people to impress them. He just showed up each morning, set up his goods, and conducted his business with quiet attention. When customers approached, Lin would greet them simply. He would ask what they needed, listen carefully to their answers, and respond honestly. If he had what they wanted, he would show it to them without embellishment. If he didn't, he would say so directly, sometimes even suggesting where else they might find it. He made no grand claims about the quality of his goods. He didn't tell stories about his past successes or name-drop important clients. He just did his work day after day with a kind of steady, unhurried presence. Now here's what's interesting. Within days, people began flocking to Lin's stall. Within weeks, he had more business than he could handle alone. Within months, he was one of the most respected merchants in the city. Meanwhile, Wei, despite all his networking and explaining and proving, struggled to find customers. People were polite to him, certainly. They listened to his stories, but they didn't trust him with their business. They didn't feel comfortable with him. And Wei couldn't understand why. One evening, frustrated and exhausted, Wei came to me. He had heard I was in the city and he sought my counsel. "Master," he said, "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. I have shown everyone my credentials. I have explained my experience. I have proven my expertise in every way I know how. But they still don't trust me. Meanwhile, that merchant Lin says almost nothing about himself, and everyone trusts him immediately. What does he have that I don't have?" I asked Wei a question. "When you speak with people, what are you thinking about?" He looked confused. "I'm thinking about how to help them understand that I'm trustworthy, that they can rely on me, that I'm competent and experienced." "And when Lin speaks with people, what do you think he's thinking about?" Wei paused. I don't know. Maybe he's thinking about their needs, about what they're asking for." "Exactly," I said. "You're thinking about yourself. He's thinking about them. You're performing. He's present. That's the difference. But it goes deeper than that. Let me explain what was really happening with these two merchants, because understanding this will change everything about how you approach trust. When Wei entered a room, his nervous system was in a state of threat. He didn't think of it that way, of course. He thought he was being professional, strategic, impressive. But underneath all his polished words and confident presentation, his body was sending out signals of anxiety. His heart rate was elevated. His muscles were slightly tense. His breathing was shallow. His eyes were constantly scanning the room, monitoring people's reactions, looking for signs of approval or disapproval. And here's what most people don't understand. Humans are incredibly sensitive to these signals. We pick them up unconsciously, beneath the level of language. When Wei talked to someone, that person's nervous system was receiving two completely contradictory messages. Wei's words were saying, "I'm confident, I'm trustworthy, I'm competent." But his body was saying, "I'm anxious, I'm performing. I need your approval to feel okay about myself." And when there's a conflict between what someone's words say and what their body says, we always trust the body. This is why Wei's credentials and explanations didn't help him. In fact, they made things worse. Because the more he tried to prove himself, the more his anxiety increased, and the more people's unconscious alarm systems went off. They couldn't articulate what felt wrong. They would just say something like, "I don't know, something feels off about him." But what they were sensing was the split in Wei. The war between his performed self and his actual self. Lin, on the other hand, had no such war happening inside him. When he showed up to his stall each morning, he wasn't thinking about his reputation. He wasn't monitoring how he was being perceived. He wasn't calculating his words to make the right impression. He was simply there, present, doing his work, responding to what was actually happening rather than trying to control what might happen. His nervous system was calm, not because he was pretending to be calm, but because he genuinely wasn't worried about proving anything. And when someone's nervous system is calm, when there's no anxiety bleeding through their presentation, when their words and their body are saying the same thing, we relax. Our own nervous system calms in response. We feel safe. And that feeling of safety is what we call trust. Do you see the paradox here? Wei was trying so hard to be trusted that he created the very anxiety that made him untrustworthy. Lin wasn't trying to be trusted at all. He was just being himself, doing his work, and trust formed naturally around him like water finding its level. This is the secret that was kept in the palace walls. This is why it's dangerous, because once you understand this mechanism, you realize that all the systems of credential and hierarchy and proof are just elaborate performances. They're ways of trying to force trust instead of allowing it. And when ordinary people understand that trust doesn't come from external validation, from titles or positions or credentials, they stop waiting for permission. They stop needing the approval of those in power. They simply start being themselves. And in that authenticity, they become more powerful than any amount of positioning could ever make them. I watched Wei struggle with this teaching for months, because accepting it meant letting go of everything he thought he knew about how to succeed in the world. It meant admitting that all his efforts to prove himself were actually the problem, not the solution. It meant confronting a terrifying question. If I stop performing, if I stop trying to convince people I'm trustworthy, who am I? And that question, that's the real work. That's where the transformation happens. Let me tell you about another student, because this story gets at something even deeper. His name was Chen, and he came to me paralyzed by self-doubt. Every time he opened his mouth, you could hear it, the constant hedging, the endless qualifications, the apologetic tone. He would say things like, "I might be wrong, but I think," or "This is just my opinion, but," or "I'm no expert, but it seems to me." Every single sentence began with a disclaimer, a preemptive apology for taking up space with his thoughts. At first, I thought this was just a habit of speech, something we could correct with practice. But as I listened to Chen more carefully, I realized the problem went much deeper. He wasn't just being humble or polite. He was genuinely terrified. Terrified that if he stated something directly, someone might challenge him. Terrified that if he spoke with confidence, he might be revealed as a fraud. Terrified that his thoughts and opinions weren't valuable enough to merit clear, direct expression. One day, I gave Chen an assignment. I said, "For one full day, I want you to speak without explaining yourself. No qualifications, no apologies, no preemptive defenses. If someone asks your opinion, just give it. If you state a fact, just state it. Don't justify your right to speak. Just speak." Chen looked at me like I'd asked him to walk across fire. "But master," he said, and notice even in protesting, he's starting with "but." What if I'm wrong? What if someone disagrees? What if I sound arrogant or presumptuous? "Then you'll find out," I said. "Do the assignment." He returned the next evening, and I could see immediately that something had shaken in him. His face was pale. His hands were trembling slightly. He sat down across from me and said, and I remember this precisely because it was the first time I'd ever heard him speak without hedging, "I'm terrified." "Tell me what happened," I said. "I tried to do what you asked," Chen said. "I went through my day trying to speak without explaining or apologizing, and at first it felt impossible. Every time I was about to say something, my mind would flood with all the reasons I needed to qualify it, all the ways it might be wrong, all the people who might judge me for it. But I forced myself. I just stated things directly, even though it felt arrogant, even though it felt wrong." "And what happened?" "That's what's terrifying," Chen said. "Nothing happened. People didn't attack me. They didn't call me arrogant. They just responded normally. Some agreed, some disagreed, some asked questions, but nobody seemed bothered by the fact that I wasn't apologizing for existing. And then I realized something that's shaking me to my core." He paused, and I waited. "All this time," Chen continued, "I thought the explanations were helping me communicate more clearly. I thought the disclaimers were making me more trustworthy because they showed I was humble and aware of my limitations. But today, when I spoke without all that padding, people actually listened more carefully, they engaged more directly, and I realized the explanations weren't clarifying my truth. They were hiding it. They were armor. They were a way of never actually showing up, never actually committing to what I think or feel or know." "What are you hiding from?" I asked. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. That's what's terrifying. When I stopped explaining, I had this moment where I thought, if I'm not the person who apologizes and qualifies and explains, then who am I?" And I didn't have an answer. It was like I'd been wearing a costume for so long that I couldn't remember what I looked like underneath it. "That feeling," I said, "that not knowing, that nakedness, that's the doorway to trust. Not the trust others have in you, but the trust you have in yourself. And you cannot be trusted by others until you trust yourself." Chen sat with this for a long time. Then he said, "But how do I trust myself when I don't even know who myself is anymore?" "You start," I said, "by noticing what's true right now. Not what should be true. Not what you wish were true. Not what would make you look good if it were true. Just what's actually true. Right now, what's true is that you're scared and confused. Can you trust that? Can you let that be real without needing to explain it or apologize for it or dress it up in more acceptable clothing?" This is the work that most people never do. We think trust is about presenting a trustworthy image. about convincing others that we're reliable and competent and worthy of their confidence. But real trust, the kind that actually connects human beings, the kind that creates safety and allows vulnerability and builds something solid, that kind of trust only happens when we stop trying to convince anyone of anything and start simply being what we actually are in this moment. Let me break this down more carefully because I want you to really understand the mechanism here. Trust is recognition, not persuasion. What does that mean? It means that when someone trusts you, they're not trusting you because you've convinced them with your arguments or impressed them with your credentials. They're trusting you because they recognize themselves in you. They see their own humanity reflected back. They sense that you're not performing, not pretending, not hiding, and in that authenticity, they feel permission to stop performing themselves. Think about the last time you felt completely safe with another person, really safe, not impressed by them, not admiring them from a distance, but actually safe in their presence. What created that feeling? I'm guessing it wasn't their resume. It wasn't their eloquence or their confidence or their social status. It was something else, something harder to name. It was the sense that this person wasn't trying to be anything other than what they were. They weren't performing for you. They weren't managing your perception of them. They were just there, present, real, undefended. And in that quality of presence, your own defenses could relax. You didn't have to perform either. You could be confused, uncertain, imperfect, and it was okay. That's what safety feels like. That's what trust is. Now contrast that with someone who's trying very hard to be trustworthy. Someone who's telling you all the reasons you should trust them, presenting their credentials, explaining their qualifications, demonstrating their competence. What happens in your body when you're around that person? If you pay attention, you'll notice a subtle tightening, a guardedness. Your own performance mode activates in response to theirs. You start monitoring what you say, how you're coming across. The interaction becomes a kind of theater where both of you are playing roles rather than meeting as actual human beings. This is what was happening with Wei, the merchant. Every time he tried to prove his trustworthiness, he activated other people's defenses. He forced them into performance mode. And in that mode, trust can't form. It's like trying to grow a plant in concrete. Here's what's really happening at the physiological level, because understanding this will help you see why performing is so counterproductive. Human beings have what scientists call mirror neurons. These are neurons in our brains that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. They're part of how we learn, how we empathize, how we connect with others. When you watch someone smile, your mirror neurons fire as if you're smiling. When you see someone in pain, your mirror neurons fire as if you're experiencing that pain. This is the biological basis of empathy. But mirror neurons don't just respond to actions, they respond to emotional states. When you're around someone who's anxious, your own nervous system picks up that anxiety. When you're around someone who's calm, you tend to calm down too. This happens beneath conscious awareness. You can't think your way out of it. Your body responds to other bodies automatically, involuntarily. So when you're performing, when you're anxious about how you're being perceived, when there's a gap between what you're presenting and what you're actually feeling, the person you're talking to picks that up. Their mirror neurons sense the anxiety underneath your confident words. They feel the performance, the effort, the trying, and their own nervous system responds with a subtle alarm. Something's not quite right here. I need to stay guarded. You've probably experienced this yourself. You meet someone who seems perfectly nice, says all the right things, presents themselves well, but something feels off. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you don't fully relax around them. What you're sensing is the gap between their presentation and their actual state. Your body is receiving contradictory information, and in the face of that contradiction, it defaults to caution. This is why all the advice about building trust through consistency and follow-through and keeping your promises, while not wrong exactly, misses the deeper point. Yes, you should keep your promises. Yes, reliability matters. But if you're reliable while being inauthentic, people still won't fully trust you. They'll work with you maybe. They'll acknowledge your competence, but they won't feel safe with you. And without safety, there's no real trust. The deepest trust happens when someone can sense that you're not at war with yourself, that there's no split between your inner experience and your outer presentation, that you're not hiding parts of yourself or performing an image or trying to convince them of anything. You're just here, as you actually are, and you're okay with that. This brings me to what I call the divided self, and this is where most people get stuck. From the time we're very young, we learn that being ourselves isn't quite acceptable. Maybe you expressed anger and were told, nice children don't get angry. Maybe you expressed fear and were told, don't be such a baby. Maybe you were too loud, too quiet, too sensitive, too intense, too much, not enough. Whatever the specific message was, you learned that parts of you needed to be hidden, controlled, or eliminated in order to be loved, accepted, included. So you split yourself. You created an acceptable self, the self you show to the world, and you pushed the unacceptable parts into shadow. You learned to perform the acceptable self so convincingly that you almost forgot the unacceptable parts existed. Almost, but not quite, because those hidden parts are still there, still operating, still influencing you from beneath consciousness, and other people can feel them. This is what I mean by the divided self. Part of you wants to speak plainly. Another part edits every word, terrified of judgment. Part of you knows what you know. Another part bows to every loud voice in the room, doubting your own perception. Part of you feels what you feel. Another part tries to talk you out of those feelings because they're inconvenient or inappropriate or weak. This constant internal negotiation, this war with yourself, this is what others sense as untrustworthiness. Not your mistakes, not your flaws, not your imperfections, your internal divided house, the fact that you're not on your own side. Think about it. If you don't trust your own feelings, your own perceptions, your own knowing, why would anyone else trust them? If you're constantly second-guessing yourself, editing yourself, arguing with yourself, that uncertainty broadcasts to everyone around you. They don't hear, here's someone who's thoughtfully considering multiple perspectives. They hear, here's someone who doesn't trust themselves. So I probably shouldn't trust them either. The people we call trustworthy, the ones who enter a room and everyone relaxes, the ones who speak and people listen, the ones who lead and others follow, they all share one quality. They're not at war with themselves. They've made peace with their own humanity. They're not trying to be someone other than who they are. They've integrated the acceptable and unacceptable parts, the strengths and the weaknesses, the knowing and the not knowing, into a coherent whole. This is what integrity actually means. Not moral righteousness, not perfect consistency, not never making mistakes. Integrity comes from the Latin integer, meaning whole, complete, intact. A person of integrity is an integrated person, not perfect, not without contradictions, but whole, not fragmented into acceptable and unacceptable selves, but unified in their humanity. And here's the beautiful paradox. The moment you stop trying to hide your humanity becomes trustworthy. The moment you stop trying to convince people you don't have doubts, your honesty about your doubts creates trust. The moment you stop performing certainty and admit I don't know, people trust your knowledge more, not less, because they know you're telling them the truth instead of protecting your image. I've watched this transformation happen hundreds of times. A student comes to me performing competence, trying so hard to look like they have everything figured out, and everyone keeps them at arm's length. Then something happens, a crisis, a failure, a moment of breaking, and the performance cracks. The real person underneath shows through. They stop trying to manage everyone's perception and just let themselves be seen, confused and uncertain and imperfect. And suddenly, people trust them. People move toward them instead of away. People relax in their presence. What changed? Not their competence, not their knowledge, not their credentials. What changed is they stopped being divided. They stopped fighting with themselves. They became whole, integrated, real. And realness is what we trust. Let me give you a very practical example of how this shows up in everyday life. Imagine you're in a meeting and someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to. You have two options. Option 1. You fumble around trying to sound knowledgeable. You piece together fragments of things you've heard. You speak in vague generalities. You use sophisticated sounding language to mask the fact that you don't actually know. You're performing knowledge to avoid the embarrassment of admitting ignorance. Option 2. You simply say, I don't know, but I can find out, or I'm not sure about that. What's your understanding? You acknowledge your not knowing directly, without shame or apology. Which response creates more trust? Intellectually, you probably know it's option 2. But emotionally, option 1 feels safer, doesn't it? Because option 1 protects your image. It maintains the illusion that you're the kind of person who always knows things. Option 2 feels risky. It feels like you're exposing yourself to judgment. But here's what actually happens. When you choose option 1 and fake knowledge, everyone in the room knows. They might not call you out on it, but they sense it. They feel the performance. They notice the vagueness, the lack of specifics, the intellectual hand-waving, and they make a mental note. This person cares more about looking smart than being honest. I need to be careful about trusting their information. When you choose option 2 and simply admit not knowing, something different happens. People respect the honesty. They appreciate that you're not wasting their time with bullshit. They trust that when you do claim to know something, you actually know it, because you've demonstrated you're willing to admit when you don't. Your credibility increases rather than decreases. This is so counterintuitive that most people never figure it out. We think trust is built by never showing weakness, never admitting mistakes, never revealing doubt. We think we need to present a flawless image to be trusted. But the opposite is true. Trust is built through honesty about our limitations, through admitting mistakes, through revealing appropriate uncertainty, because those admissions signal that we value truth over image, and people trust those who value truth. I remember a government official who came to me troubled by a dilemma. He had made a policy decision that turned out to be wrong. New information had emerged showing that his approach was causing harm instead of helping. He wanted to know, should he admit the mistake publicly, or should he defend the policy and hope people didn't notice the problems? What would defending a wrong policy accomplish? I asked. It would protect my reputation, he said. If I admit I was wrong, people will lose confidence in my judgment. They'll question my competence. My political opponents will use it against me. And if you defend a policy you know is harmful, what happens to your integrity? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I lose myself. Yes, I said. And once you lose yourself, once you choose image over truth, you become a person who can't be trusted. Not by others, and not by yourself. Because you've proven that your commitment is to looking right, not being right. And everyone senses that, even if they can't articulate it. The official did end up admitting his mistake publicly. It was humiliating for him at first. His opponents did attack him for it. Some people did question his competence. But something interesting happened over time. The people who had been skeptical of him started to soften. They started to listen to him differently, because he had demonstrated something rare. He was more committed to doing the right thing than protecting his image. He was capable of learning, of changing his mind when presented with new information. He was, in other words, trustworthy. Within a year, he had more genuine support than he'd ever had when he was trying to maintain a flawless image. Because people could see he was real. He wasn't performing infallibility. He was a human being doing his best, willing to acknowledge errors, willing to change course. And that quality, that integrity in the original sense of the word, created deep trust. This is what I mean when I say trust is not built through perfection. It's built through wholeness, through being consistently yourself, even when yourself includes uncertainty, mistakes, and not knowing. Now I want to talk about something that makes people very uncomfortable, but it's essential to understand if you want to grasp how trust actually works. I want to talk about silence. Most people are terrified of silence. Silence in conversation feels dangerous, like a void that must be filled immediately, or something terrible will happen. So we fill it. We fill it with words, with explanations, with stories about ourselves, with questions we don't really care about the answers to. We fill it with nervous laughter and small talk and any sound that prevents the emptiness from existing. But silence is actually where trust forms. Silence is where presence lives. And presence is what creates safety. Think about being with someone you deeply trust. Maybe it's an old friend, maybe a partner, maybe a family member. Notice that you can be silent together. You can sit in the same room, not talking, not doing anything in particular, and it feels comfortable. The silence doesn't need to be filled. It's not awkward. It's companionable. Now think about being with someone you don't quite trust, or someone you're trying to impress, or someone you're performing for. Notice that silence with that person feels unbearable. Every second of quiet feels like pressure building. You rush to fill it with something, anything, because the silence exposes the fact that you're not really comfortable together. The difference between these two experiences is presence versus performance. With people you trust, you're present. You're not monitoring how you're being perceived. You're not calculating your next move. You're just there, and they're just there, and the being together is enough. With people you're performing for, you're not really present at all. You're in your head, managing your image, and the silence threatens to reveal that there's no real connection happening. Here's what most people don't realize. Your comfort with silence signals your comfort with yourself. When you can sit with someone without filling the air with proof of your worth, without explaining yourself, without convincing them of anything, you demonstrate that you don't need external validation to know you exist. You're solid in yourself. You don't require constant reinforcement from outside, and that solidity is what others sense as trustworthy. Think about it from the other person's perspective. If you're constantly filling silence with self-promotion, with explanations, with stories about your accomplishments, what message does that send? It says, I need you to validate me. I need you to confirm my worth. I'm not okay unless you're impressed by me. And that neediness, even when it's dressed up in confident language, creates distance, not connection. But when you can be silent, when you can let space exist without rushing to fill it, you communicate something entirely different. You communicate, I'm here with you. I don't need anything from you. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm just present. And if you want to connect, I'm available. And if you don't, that's okay too. That lack of neediness, that willingness to simply be without requiring anything in return, creates enormous trust. This is why the best listeners are so often the most trusted people. And I don't mean people who are listening in order to respond, or listening in order to find an opening to talk about themselves. I mean people who actually listen, who give you their full attention without agenda, who don't interrupt, don't correct, don't immediately relate everything back to their own experience, who can simply be with what you're saying without needing to fix it, or judge it, or one-up it with their own story. When someone listens to you that way, really listens, without performing their listening, without using your words as a springboard for their own performance, you feel seen, you feel valued, you feel safe, and that safety creates trust faster than any amount of credential, presenting, or resume reciting ever could. I teach a practice I call listening without agenda, and it's harder than it sounds. The practice is simple. When someone is talking to you, just listen. Don't prepare your response while they're speaking. Don't look for the moment when you can jump in with your own story. Don't mentally catalog their mistakes so you can correct them. Just listen as an act of pure presence. Most people can't do this for more than 30 seconds before their mind wanders to what they want to say next. We're so trained to perform, to be interesting, to demonstrate our own knowledge and experience, that we've forgotten how to simply be present with another person's reality without making it about ourselves. But when you can do this, when you can give someone your full attention without needing to prove anything or demonstrate anything or relate it back to yourself, you become someone people trust implicitly, because they sense that you're not using them as an audience for your performance. You're actually with them. You're actually here. And that quality of presence is so rare that when people encounter it, they hold on to it. This connects to something I've observed over decades of watching human interaction. Consistency isn't rigidity. Let me explain what I mean. We've been taught that being consistent means being predictable, unchanging, always the same. That to be trustworthy, we need to present the same face in every situation, maintain the same positions, never deviate from our established patterns. And while there's a truth in consistency, people do need to know what to expect from you. We've confused consistency with rigidity in a way that actually undermines trust. Real consistency is like a tree. A tree is deeply rooted, stable, reliably itself. But it's also flexible. It bends in the wind. It sheds its leaves in winter and grows them back in spring. It adapts to its environment while remaining fundamentally itself. It's consistent in its nature, not in its rigidity. Contrast this with a stone wall. A stone wall is completely predictable, completely unchanging, but it's also brittle. When enough pressure is applied, it doesn't bend, it breaks. It can't adapt. It can't respond to changing conditions. It can only remain the same until it shatters. Most people try to be trustworthy by being like stone walls. They take positions and defend them no matter what new information emerges. They create an image and maintain it no matter what's actually true. They say yes when they mean no, or they say no when they actually want to say yes, because they're locked into being the kind of person who always says yes or always says no. They're rigid, and that rigidity feels safe to them, feels like consistency, but it's actually fragile. Real consistency, tree consistency, not wall consistency, means staying true to your core principles while adapting to context. It means being willing to say, "I was wrong," when you learn something new. It means being willing to change your position when the evidence changes. It means being willing to be different things in different situations, serious in one context, playful in another, without that being a contradiction or a performance. The paradox is that admitting mistakes actually increases trust rather than decreases it. Because when you can say, "I was wrong," you prove that your consistency is to truth, not to image. You prove that you're capable of learning, of growing, of changing your mind when presented with new information. You prove that your commitment is to being right, not to looking right. And people trust that. People trust someone who can acknowledge error far more than someone who defends every position to protect their reputation. I remember a student who was paralyzed by this issue. He had taken a strong position on a community matter and later discovered his position was based on incomplete information. But he couldn't bring himself to change his stance publicly because he thought it would make him look weak, inconsistent, untrustworthy. "What will people think if I admit I was wrong?" he asked me. "They'll think you value truth more than pride," I said. "They'll think you're capable of learning. They'll think you're honest enough to acknowledge when you've made a mistake. Which of those qualities would make you less trustworthy?" "But consistency." "Consistency to what?" I interrupted. "To an error? To a position you know is wrong? That's not consistency. That's stubbornness. Consistency means staying true to your principles, and if one of your principles is honesty, then acknowledging your mistakes is the consistent thing to do." He did eventually change his position publicly. And you know what happened? Some people attacked him for flip-flopping, yes. But many more people started listening to him more carefully, because he had demonstrated that he was more interested in getting things right than in being right. He had shown that he could put truth above ego, and that quality made people trust his judgment going forward, because they knew he wasn't locked into defending positions just to save face. This is the flexibility I'm talking about. This is tree consistency versus wall consistency. Being rooted in principles but flexible in expression. Being committed to truth but willing to change positions when truth requires it. Being fundamentally yourself but not imprisoned by a rigid image of who you think you need to be. Now let me give you some very practical practices you can begin implementing immediately. These aren't complex techniques or lengthy processes. They're simple awareness practices that will start shifting how you show up and how people experience you. The first practice I call the morning integration check. Before you enter your day, before you start interacting with other people, take a moment to ask yourself, what am I pretending about myself today? Not to judge it, not to fix it, just to notice it. Are you pretending to be more confident than you feel? Are you pretending to be certain about something you're actually confused about? Are you pretending to be fine when you're actually struggling? Are you pretending to know something you don't know? Are you pretending to agree with something you actually disagree with? Are you pretending to be less angry, less scared, less hurt, less overwhelmed than you actually are? Just notice. What's the pretense? What's the gap between how you actually are and how you're planning to present yourself? And once you notice it, you have a choice. You can continue the pretense, Sometimes that's necessary, sometimes it's wise, sometimes it's just what you need to do to get through the day. But at least you'll be conscious of it. You'll know you're performing. And that consciousness alone starts to shift things. Or you can choose differently. You can choose to close the gap a little, not by oversharing, not by dumping your inner state on everyone around you, but by allowing more of your actual experience to be visible, by speaking from your real uncertainty instead of your performed certainty, by admitting, "I'm not sure about that," instead of faking expertise, by letting your actual tiredness show instead of performing energy you don't have. The morning integration check is just about bringing awareness to the split, because you can't integrate what you're not aware of. You can't become whole if you don't know where you're divided. The second practice is what I call the 3-breath pause. This is for moments of interaction, moments when someone asks your opinion, challenges you, looks to you for guidance, or puts you on the spot in any way. Before you respond, pause for 3 full breaths. In that pause, check in with yourself. Am I about to say what I actually think, or am I about to say what I think will make them approve of me? Am I responding from my real knowing, or am I performing the answer I think they want to hear? This is harder than it sounds, because the performance reflex is so deeply ingrained that we often don't even notice we're doing it. We automatically calculate what will make us look good, what will avoid conflict, what will maintain our image. And that calculation happens so fast, it feels like our real response. The 3-breath pause interrupts that automatic reflex. It creates a tiny space of awareness where you can catch yourself in the act of performing and choose something different. You can choose to speak from your actual truth instead of your performed truth. You'll be amazed at how often you discover you were about to lie. Not maliciously, not with intent to deceive, but protectively. About to say what you thought you should say instead of what you actually think. About to perform agreement when you actually disagree. About to fake understanding when you're actually confused. About to demonstrate certainty when you're actually full of doubt. The 3-breath pause gives you the chance to choose authenticity over performance. And each time you make that choice, even in small ways, you strengthen your integrity. You become more integrated, more whole. And people feel that wholeness as trustworthiness. The third practice is speak from not knowing. Once per day, practice saying, "I don't know," when you genuinely don't know, instead of fabricating an answer to appear knowledgeable. This is terrifying for most people. We've been trained to believe that admitting ignorance is weakness, that we should always have an answer, that not knowing means we're incompetent or stupid or unqualified, so we fake it. We piece together fragments of things we've half heard or vaguely remember. We speak in sophisticated-sounding generalities that don't actually mean anything. We perform knowledge we don't have, and people can tell. They might not call you out, but they sense the performance. They feel the bullshit, and it erodes trust. But when you simply say, "I don't know," cleanly, without apologizing for it, without qualifying it with lengthy explanations about why you don't know, something shifts. People relax, because they know you're telling them the truth. They know that when you do claim to know something, you actually know it, because you've demonstrated you're willing to admit when you don't. Watch what happens when you practice this. Notice the fear that arises when you're about to say, "I don't know." Notice the urge to qualify it, to explain it, to justify why you don't know, to make excuses for your not knowing. Notice the part of you that wants to add, "But let me try to figure it out," or "But I can look that up," or "But my understanding is." Just let the "I don't know" stand there, naked and undefended. Watch what actually happens. In most cases, people don't judge you. They don't think less of you. They often appreciate the honesty. They often relax and admit they don't know either. Or they share what they do know without it being a competition. The feared judgment rarely actually materializes, and even when it does, even when someone does judge you for admitting not knowing, that judgment tells you something valuable. It tells you that person values performance over honesty, image over truth. It tells you that you probably can't trust them because they're operating in performance mode, and that's useful information to have. The fourth practice is the daily realness audit. At the end of each day, take a few minutes to reflect. When was I most myself today? When was I most performed? Don't judge it. Don't berate yourself for the moments you performed. Just notice. When did you feel most authentic, most present, most integrated? What situations allowed that? What people? What contexts? And when did you feel most divided, most performative, most split between your actual experience and your presentation? What situations triggered that? What people? What fears? Over time, you'll start to see patterns. You'll notice that with certain people, you can be real. With others, you automatically shift into performance mode. In certain situations, you're naturally authentic. In others, you're guarded and performed. This awareness is gold, because once you see the patterns, you can start making conscious choices. You can start recognizing the triggers that make you shift into performance. You can start noticing the people and situations where you feel safe being real. You can start gradually extending that realness into more and more of your life. This isn't about becoming perfectly authentic all the time. That's not realistic or even wise. There are situations that require some level of performance, some level of social filtering, but it's about increasing your awareness of when you're performing and why, and decreasing the amount of unconscious, automatic performance you engage in. The goal is integration, not elimination. The goal is to be more and more yourself in more and more situations, with more and more people. To close the gap between your inner experience and your outer presentation. To become whole instead of fragmented, integrated instead of divided. These practices are simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. What you're really doing with these practices is training yourself to value truth over approval, to value authenticity over image, to value being real over being liked. And that's a revolutionary act in a world that rewards performance. You're going to fail at this constantly. You're going to catch yourself performing and think, damn it, I did it again. You're going to have moments where you choose image over truth and immediately regret it. You're going to notice yourself apologizing for existing and feel frustrated that you still do that. This is all part of the process. Be gentle with yourself. The fact that you're noticing is huge. The fact that you're aware of the split is the first step toward healing it. You can't integrate what you don't see. You can't become whole if you don't know where you're divided. And remember, the goal isn't perfection. The goal isn't to never perform, never pretend, never put on a social face. The goal is to be conscious of when you're doing it and why, and to have more and more moments where you don't need to, where you can just be yourself and trust that yourself is enough. Because here's the truth that this whole teaching has been circling toward. You are enough, exactly as you are, with all your confusion and uncertainty and imperfection and not knowing. You are enough. You were always enough. The performance was never necessary. It was just what you learned to survive in a world that told you being yourself wasn't acceptable. But the performance is exhausting, and it doesn't even work. It doesn't create the trust and connection you're longing for. It creates distance. It creates isolation. It creates the very rejection you're trying to avoid. The way out is through. The way to be trusted is to stop trying to be trustworthy and start being real. The way to connect is to stop performing connection and start risking your actual self. The way to be seen is to stop showing people what you think they want to see and start revealing what's actually true. This is terrifying. I know. I've watched thousands of people struggle with this. The fear of being rejected for who you actually are is primal. It feels like death. Because in our evolutionary past, rejection from the tribe was death. We're wired to do whatever it takes to be accepted, even if that means hiding our truth, performing an acceptable self, fragmenting into divided pieces. But here's what you need to understand. You're already being rejected. The performed self is being accepted, maybe, but you're being rejected. The real you, the actual you, the you beneath the performance, that you is invisible, unknown, unseen. And that's a kind of rejection too, maybe the deepest kind, because it means that even when people like you, they don't actually know you. They like the performance, and you're left feeling hollow and alone, even in rooms full of people who approve of you. The path I'm offering is different. It's the path of risking your real self, of letting yourself be seen, actually seen, in all your imperfect humanity. Yes, some people will reject that. Some people only know how to relate to performances, and when you stop performing, they'll drift away. And that will hurt. But the people who stay, the people who can meet your realness with their own realness, those connections will be deeper than anything you've ever experienced, because they'll be connecting with you, not your performance. They'll be seeing you, not your image. They'll be trusting you, not your credentials. And isn't that what you actually want? Not to be admired from a distance, not to be approved of for your performance, but to be known and valued for who you actually are. This is the ancient rule that was kept in the palace walls. This is the dangerous teaching, because when ordinary people understand this, they stop performing for those in power. They stop needing validation from external authorities. They stop waiting to be chosen, approved, credentialed, certified. They simply are themselves, and in that being, they become uncontrollable. They become sovereign. They trust themselves. And that self-trust makes them trustworthy to others, and that trustworthiness gives them a kind of power that no amount of positioning or credentials can provide. The emperors knew this. The priests knew this. The merchants knew this. They knew that trust doesn't flow from authority or status or proof. It flows from authenticity, from wholeness, from integration, from being the same person in private that you are in public, from valuing truth over image, from being at peace with your own humanity instead of at war with it. And they knew that if everyone understood this, the whole structure of power would shift. Because power built on performance and credential and hierarchical proof only works as long as people believe that's where trust comes from. Once people realize that trust comes from somewhere else entirely, that structure crumbles. So they kept it secret. They made it esoteric. They created elaborate systems of proving and credentialing and status seeking that kept people focused on the wrong thing, kept people performing, kept people divided against themselves, and therefore controllable. But the teaching is actually simple, almost absurdly simple. So simple that people often dismiss it as too obvious to be the answer. The teaching is, stop performing, start being. Stop trying to convince people you're trustworthy, and start being integrated enough that trust forms naturally. Stop fighting with yourself and become whole. That's it. That's the whole thing. Simple, but not easy. because it requires facing all the fears that drove you into performance in the first place. The fear of rejection, the fear of not being enough, the fear of being seen in your actual uncertainty and imperfection and still figuring it outness and being judged as inadequate. Those fears are real. I'm not going to tell you they're not. The risk is real. Some people will reject you. Some people will judge you. Some people will not understand why you're no longer performing and will interpret your authenticity as arrogance or weirdness or unprofessionalism. But the people who matter, the people who are capable of real connection, the people who are also exhausted by performance and longing for something real, those people will recognize you. They'll feel the safety in your presence. They'll trust you in a way they've never trusted a performance. And those connections will sustain you in ways that approval never could. I want to leave you with this. Everything I've shared today comes down to a simple shift in orientation. Right now, you're probably oriented toward the question, how do I get people to trust me? That question keeps you in performance mode. It keeps you focused on managing perceptions, presenting credentials, convincing others of your worthiness. I'm inviting you to shift to a different question. How do I become integrated enough that trust forms naturally? That question points you inward. It points you toward the work of healing your own internal divisions, making peace with your own humanity, trusting yourself so that others can trust you. The first question keeps you dependent on external validation. The second question makes you sovereign. The first question exhausts you with endless performance. The second question frees you to simply be. The first question never quite works, no matter how hard you try. The second question works naturally, without effort, because you're aligning with how trust actually operates. You don't need to become someone else to be trusted. You don't need more credentials, more proof, more evidence of your worth. You need to stop pretending to be someone else. You need to recognize that the you beneath the performance, confused, uncertain, still figuring it out, is the only you anyone has ever actually trusted. Every time you felt truly trusted, truly seen, truly safe with another person, it wasn't because you had convinced them of anything. It was because you had stopped trying to convince them. It was because you had let yourself be real. And in that realness, they felt permission to be real too. And in that mutual realness, trust appeared like water finding its level. That's what's available to you. Not occasionally, not only with special people, but as your default way of being in the world. Trust as your natural state. Connection as your birthright. Being seen and valued for who you actually are, instead of performing for approval you'll never quite feel satisfied by. The path is simple. Notice where you're divided. Notice where you're performing. Notice where you're pretending, and little by little, moment by moment, choice by choice, close those gaps. Speak from your actual truth instead of your performed truth. Admit your not knowing instead of faking knowledge. Let your real uncertainty show instead of performing confidence. Be as you actually are instead of as you think you should be. Will you be rejected sometimes? Yes. Will you be misunderstood sometimes? Yes. Will it be uncomfortable and scary and feel like you're walking around without skin? Yes. But will you finally feel like yourself? Will you finally stop carrying the exhausting weight of performance? Will you finally build connections based on who you actually are instead of who you're pretending to be? Yes. 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 You're not broken. You're not insufficient. You've simply been taught to distrust the most trustworthy thing about you. Your honest, unperformed humanity. When you stop performing, You stop forcing others to perform. When you relax into not knowing, others can finally exhale. This is how trust forms, not through credentials, but through presence, not through proving, but through being. Stop performing, start being. The world is waiting for the real you, not the impressive version, not the polished version, not the version that has it all figured out, the real you. Confused and uncertain and still learning and perfectly beautifully human. That you is trustworthy, that you always was. You just forgot while you were busy trying to become someone else. Remember, come home, be yourself, and watch how trust appears naturally around that authenticity, like flowers growing in soil that's finally stopped being concrete. If this perspective shifted something in you, if you felt a little less alone in the performance you've been giving, if something in these words recognized something in you and made you feel seen, leave me a comment below. Tell me what resonated. Tell me what you're struggling with. Tell me what you're realizing about your own divided self. I read these comments, every single one, and your reflections often teach me as much as I hope I've taught you. And if you want more of these conversations, more of this kind of depth, more invitations to become whole instead of performed, subscribe. Not because I need your approval, not because I'm trying to build numbers or metrics or any of that external validation, but because this work matters. Because there are so few spaces left in the world where we can talk about what's actually true instead of what's impressive. Because I'd be honored to walk alongside you as you find your way back to yourself. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough about truth to spend this time exploring what trust actually is and where it actually comes from. That curiosity, that willingness to question what you've been taught, that openness to seeing things differently, that's the beginning of becoming whole. You're already on the path. Keep walking. I'll be here.